Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my guest, as usual, Mouin Rabbani. Thank you, Mouin, for joining us.
Thank you, Nasim. Pleasure to be with you again.
Yes, we have a full-packed show, beginning with Israel's offensive in Rafah. Then we'll move to the ceasefire talks with Hamas. Ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas, which Hamas has accepted and Israel has rejected. And then, Moin, I want to get your thoughts on the face-off, shall we say, between the ICC and Washington. Washington has issued threats against the ICC, so has Israel. So we'll be looking into that in detail. Then we'll move on to an interesting development last week, which is the likelihood of the US-Saudi agreeing to a plan B instead of the plan A, which was to normalize relations with Israel and in return for US security guarantees. But Saudi have proposed a different plan. So we'll talk about that as well. And also development from last week, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which was passed by the House of Congress, the fallout from that. And then we'll look more broadly at some of the broader crackdown on pro-Palestinian activism, not just in the US, but also in Europe. But let's begin, Moin, with the latest development in Rafah. Israeli forces have taken control of the crossing, despite, I think it was in March, when Biden said that Rafah was a red line. So this is, I don't know how many times Israel and others have crossed American red line without any consequences. And this incursion is taking place even after Hamas had agreed to a ceasefire proposal put forward by the Qataris and the Egyptians. So to just kick off with getting your thoughts on the onslaught or incursion into Rafah, and the timing of that.
Yes. Well, Israel on Monday evening commenced with a ground invasion of Rafah, and as you mentioned, also seized the Palestinian Egyptian border zone, what Israelis refer to as the so-called Philadelphia corridor. And I think it's significant in several respects. The first, just as you mentioned, is that President Biden personally and publicly referred to an Israeli invasion of Rafah as a red line. Egypt also significantly has characterized such an invasion as a direct threat to its national security. And as with so many of Israel's actions, what I think we can expect is that Israel has launched a invasion into selected parts of the Rafah region, basically seeing if there's going to be an international reaction. Particularly, it will be looking at how the Americans and the Egyptians respond. And if there are not serious consequences, then it will push further, and so on. And this has been a consistent pattern in Israeli conduct. It knows it has impunity. It knows it won't be held accountable, but at the same time is also risk averse and doesn't take these as given. So it pushes a bit, looks for the reaction. If the reaction is limited or non-existent, then it pushes further and further until it's able to do as it pleases. And of course, we don't know what will happen in the coming days, but so far at least, the US has shifted its position from characterizing a ground invasion of Rafah as a red line to now saying it is opposed to a major ground invasion. As for the Egyptians, we haven't yet heard anything from them. Given the close alliance between Cairo and Tel Aviv, we may not see any response from the Egyptians. The Jordanians, whose king was very recently in Washington and spoke out strongly against an invasion of Rafah also haven't taken any measures. So it looks like once again, Israel will be able to act with impunity against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Bearing in mind also that Rafah has been a key transportation node for humanitarian aid deliveries into the Gaza Strip, and that's now completely sealed, as has any travel into and out of the Gaza Strip through the only available crossing point. And of course, Rafah is significant in several respects. It's the most important town that Israel has not yet invaded with ground forces. It hasn't invaded Deir al-Balah to the north either, but that's a much smaller town. And secondly, Rafah is where well over 1.5 million Palestinians are currently located, most of them not residents of Rafah, but refugees in Rafah, people who have been displaced from Gaza City, from Khan Yunis, from the central refugee camps and other areas further north. So it's, anyone who has looked at this, UN officials, even European officials, even American officials, have described what could happen in Rafah as an unparalleled catastrophe. But then again, these are only Palestinian lives, and it doesn't look at present like there's going to be much of a regional or international response to Israel's latest chapter of its genocidal onslaught.
If I can pick up on one of the first points you made, which is that Israel is testing the international community, or US in particular here, to see if it will stop and obstruct Israel's incursion into Rafah. This is something which Israel has tried and tested. It's a part of its playbook. We saw that, we spoke about that last week in its bombing of Al-Ahle hospital. Because there was no international backlash to that and blame was pinned on the Palestinians, Israel went on to decimate the entire health facility in Gaza. Yes. What kind of response do you think will stop Israel? I mean, I think last week there was reports of US pausing arms export to Israel, and there was a lot of complaints from a number of pro-Israeli commentators and also members of Congress. What kind of response do you think we could expect? Because, as I said, we are in a different place to when Al-Ahli happened. There is a genocide case. There is a international backlash against Israel. We are in a completely different place to where we were 5-6 months ago. What kind of response do you think would stop Israel from launching an all-out attack and decimating Rafah?
Well, what would be required, I think, are a number of things. First of all, a clear and public statement from the United States that it will not tolerate an Israeli ground invasion in Rafah, and calling on it to immediately withdraw its forces, and making clear to Israel, publicly or privately, that if it fails to do so, that the United States will not use its veto power, for example, at the UN Security Council with respect to any resolutions that condemn Israel's conduct, that it will not intervene, for example, with the International Criminal Court to seek to dissuade it from considering any cases against Israel, that it will halt arms deliveries, and not just certain types of weapons. Basically, Israel would need to be told that if you insist on doing this, you're going to be on your own, and don't look to Washington for protection. And I think that would be more than sufficient, because Israel recognizes how thoroughly dependent it is on the United States, militarily, politically, and diplomatically. As for the Arab states, Egypt and Jordan could, at the very least, withdraw their ambassadors from Israel. Saudi Arabia yesterday, I think, for the first time, described what Israel is currently engaged in as genocide, and whether as individual Arab states or collectively, a clear message is sent to Israel of this far and no further. and from now on, we're going to do more than appeal to the United States to put an end to this, even though we know the United States will do nothing. That's also something that could have an impact on Israeli conduct. But based on past performance, I see not too much reason for optimism in this situation.
And do you see any link between the incursion into Rafah and the stalled negotiation? Because it's in Israel's interest not to, I would say, have peace talks that succeed. Right from the outset, we saw two different interests. One was from the Israeli side, that is, one was to secure the release of 132 hostages, which Netanyahu says is his priority, and the other is to, maintain the far-right cabinet and the future of Netanyahu. And those two goals, I would say, are not in
They're in
line. They're
opposition.
in
Yeah.
opposition. They're not in line.
Yes.
So again, I have never seen throughout the last 6 months any point where Israel has actually put the hostages ahead of the interest of the far-right cabinet or Netanyahu himself. So is that what you see as a reason for rejecting the current peace talks, which Hamas has accepted?
Partially, yes. I mean, I think we also need to recognize that this is about much more than just Prime Minister Netanyahu seeking to maintain his coalition and prevent it from disintegrating. This is also about an Israeli political leadership collectively, and an Israeli military leadership and an Israeli security establishment that is desperate to erase the stain of failure with which it has been tainted since the 7th of October of last year, and that is desperate to regain the trust and confidence of the Israeli people, which it, to a significant extent, lost on the 7th of October of last year. And so, given a broader situation in which Israel has been unable to achieve any of its announced war aims in terms of eliminating Hamas, eradicating it as a coherent fighting force, overthrowing Hamas's ability to rule the Gaza Strip. In that context, it's under the illusion that if it can somehow do to Rafah what it did to Gaza City, what it did to Khan Yunis, what it did to the Nusayrat refugee camp, and what it has done elsewhere, that this time it will succeed. Sinwar and these other Hamas leaders are like a jack in the box. First, they were in Gaza City, then they were hiding under Al Shifa Hospital, then they were hiding in Khan Yunis, and now we're supposed to believe that actually they're all in Rafah. And so Israel is, in a sense, throwing good money after bad. The second aspect, of course, is that you have the announced declared Israeli war aims and also the undeclared Israeli war aims, which is to make the Gaza Strip unfit for human habitation, the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, of housing stock, and so on. And for that, you need not only an air force, but also actual physical control on the ground. I mean, we've all seen the video images of Israeli soldiers planting mines in schools and housing in apartment blocks and so on, and then blowing them up to much celebration among the vandals who have been conducting these attacks. But getting back to your question about the negotiations, they are very closely related because last week, for the first time in many months, with Washington's dispatch of CIA Director William Burns to the region, it became possible again to take these negotiations seriously. And what happened is that the Qatari and the Egyptian mediators, in consultation with the United States and Burns specifically, crafted a ceasefire proposal that Israel was confident Hamas would reject because it didn't explicitly include provisions for permanent end to Israel's war, which had been one of Hamas's key demands. When it then appeared that the Hamas delegation that went to Cairo to provide its response to this proposal had been instructed to engage seriously and positively with the proposal and to seek to reach an agreement based on that proposal, the Israeli government panicked. So you began to get statements from Prime Minister Netanyahu that Israel was determined to invade Rafah, whether or not there was an agreement, that the war would continue until total victory or whatever the terms was. And Israel additionally refused to send a delegation to Cairo until Hamas accepted the proposal that was on offer. Now, the impact of Israel, oh, and it additionally, Israel shut down Al Jazeera within Israel. And of course, this isn't an assault on press freedom, but I think Israel's objective was less to muzzle Al Jazeera than it was to alienate the Qatari mediators and hopefully get them to withdraw their involvement in seeking a ceasefire agreement. So what Israel achieved was that Hamas lost confidence in their proposal and lost confidence in informal American assurances it had received that if it accepted this three-stage deal, that the result by the third stage would be a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And rather than accepting the agreement, the Hamas delegation returned to Doha for further consultations. The Egyptians and the Qataris were enraged by Israel's antics. I think it's fair to conclude that Burns specifically and the United States generally were none too pleased with Israel's behavior as well. And a day later, negotiations recommenced in Qatar, with Burns this time also traveling from Cairo to Qatar. Now, multiple press reports that have emerged since then have confirmed that what happened is that the Qataris and the Egyptians introduced several minor modifications into the ceasefire proposal, and additionally strengthened the American guarantees regarding the implementation of the initiative and about an end to the war. Did this in very close consultation with Burns, who must have also been consulting with his superiors in Washington. On that basis, Hamas on Monday evening formally accepted the ceasefire proposal. And what happened then is, in an effort once again to subvert it, Israel launched its ground invasion of Rafah and has now been complaining, we weren't involved in these negotiations. Well, of course they weren't involved because they chose not to be involved. So you can't, you can't absent yourself from a process and then complain that you were not part of it. But that's exactly what Israel has been doing. And the question now is, to what extent will Americans, not only as anonymous sources speaking to American reporters, express their displeasure with Israel's conduct, but also publicly pin the blame directly on Israel? Because bear in mind, when Israel's chief cheerleader in Washington, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, was commenting on these things, he was constantly speaking about an extraordinarily generous Israeli offer, about Hamas being the only obstacle to reaching a ceasefire agreement, and if only Hamas would say yes, it would all be over. Well, now it's time for some honesty out of Washington, but I wouldn't hold my breath unless I was suicidal.
Going back to one of the points you made in your answer about the modification. So does the modification include a permanent ceasefire? I mean, I want a bit more clarity on that. And also talks of what happens afterwards. And I saw reports this week of the UN saying that the redevelopment of Gaza will take from 16 to even 80 years and may cost as much as 40 billion, dollars. That's an extraordinary amount of money, extremely long period of time. Who governs this this project? Who and the redevelopment of Gaza? Were any of those issues discussed in the negotiation, and the modification, did it include also a permanent ceasefire?
Yes, well, Al Jazeera today on its English language website published what it states is the official text of the proposal put forward by the Egyptians and Qataris and agreed with the Americans, and that was accepted by Hamas. There's little reason to doubt the authenticity of that document. We unfortunately don't yet have the previous text so that we can compare the changes, but what sources are reporting in the press is that the additional changes were fairly minor. And the language used is not, quote, permanent ceasefire, unquote, but I believe something like sustained quiet or sustained calm or something like that, and which the Americans appear to have informally assured would translate into a permanent ceasefire if Hamas implemented the previous stages of the agreement. There are other issues in the proposal that require further clarification. For example, it states that by the end of the third and final stage of the agreement, the siege being the word that's used, would be permanently lifted from the Gaza Strip. Now, that looks very straightforward, but when this agreement uses siege, will Israel and its allies down the line say that by siege we meant the siege on food, water, fuel, and electricity that was imposed on the 7th of October? Or will it mean the blockade that was imposed on the Gaza Strip almost 2 decades ago, thereby once again allowing free trade and free movement into and out of the Gaza Strip? So those are questions that remain to be resolved. As far as reconstruction is concerned, the agreement mentions that a committee, I believe, consisting of Arab states, the United Nations, including UNRWA, and others, would take responsibility or at least actively participate in the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. To the best of my knowledge, it doesn't mention any amounts of what would be devoted to reconstruction. And as far as governance is concerned, I believe I'm correct in stating that the agreement says nothing about governance. And that's for the simple reason that Israel would never accept that Hamas would play a role in governance, if not maintain its governance of the Gaza Strip. While Hamas, by all accounts, is not going anywhere and has in fact been reestablishing its authority in those areas in the northern and central Gaza Strip from which Israel has withdrawn its ground forces. So yes, there are unresolved issues. There are issues that require further clarity, but on the whole, it does seem that this is a proposal that would result in the end of the war, provided, of course, that the Americans make good on their word. But unfortunately, there's also a long history of the Americans making assurances to the Palestinians about this, that, and the other that end up being nothing more than hot air.
Let's turn our attention to another key development from last week, which is the breakdown of relationship, I would say, between the ICC and the US. One of the things I noticed right from the beginning of this war, as have many others, is how the US have given all the arms and all the arsenal on the one hand to execute Israel genocide, and on the other have done everything they can to control the narrative and crack down on dissent and prevent any kind of condemnation of Israel. And we see that now being played out with the ICC. So Israel has threatened the ICC. US lawmakers sent a letter to the ICC threatening Karim Khan, not just him, saying threatening his family and his staff in a very mafia-like style. So I want to get your thoughts on that. But in particular, I mean, now does that make the ICC, or does that put more pressure on the ICC, Karim Khan, to issue arrest warrants against Netanyahu? Because if it doesn't do that, then it will be seen as having caved into pressure from Washington and Tel Aviv. So I think, does that incentivize, in your view, Karim Khan to issue arrest warrants against Netanyahu?
One would hope so, but it's worth recalling that this entire episode began about a week or two ago when Israel began ringing the alarm bells, claiming that the International Criminal Court was on the verge of issuing a number of indictments and arrest warrants that would include senior Israeli leaders. Purportedly including Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, Chief of Staff Halevi, I believe is his name, and a number of others. It's reported that, Karim Khan can't just wake up in the morning and issue indictments and arrest warrants. He needs the authorization of a panel of judges, what's called, I believe, the pretrial chamber. And it's reported that the intention to issue these indictments leaked from that committee of judges. There's been absolutely no evidence that any of this is true. It may be true. It may all just be a false alarm as seen from Israel's perspective. But nevertheless, it put Israel and its apologists into overdrive. And you began to see all kinds of threats and denunciations coming from Netanyahu himself, all the other usual suspects in the Israeli pecking order, and last, but by no means least, also from the United States. The White House and State Department sufficed with utterly false statements that the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over this case, whereas in fact there's a very long and detailed history demonstrating precisely that it does and why it does. But then last week, or was it last week, we also saw a statement issued by the Office of the ICC prosecutor denouncing threats and attempts to intimidate the International Criminal Court and pointing out that efforts to interfere in the work of the International Criminal Court were themselves violations of the Rome Statute, which governs the work of the ICC, and could themselves constitute indictable crimes. Now, at the time, everyone thought this was the court's way of responding to the hysterics coming from Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders. But it has now emerged, thanks to a document obtained and released by the journalist Mehdi Hassan of Zeteo, that this was most likely a response to a letter sent to the office of Karim Khan by 12 US senators, including Israel's chief hitmen in the Senate, Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, and the rest of them, as you mentioned, directly threatening the court, its prosecutor, their families, their staff, and so on. Something out of The Godfather. It's the only comparison I can come up with. And not only that, they describe any effort by the ICC to issue indictments against Israeli leaders as not only a violation of Israeli sovereignty, but also as a violation of US sovereignty. It's out of this world. This is the inmates taking over the asylum and turning it into the world's most fantastic madhouse.
And on the issue of jurisdiction, Karim Khan's predecessor, Fateh Bensouda, made that determination long before, that it does have jurisdiction over Palestine and it can prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity on Palestine. So I think that that's a foregone conclusion for them
to... Well, just to be clear, if I may, it wasn't Fatou Bensouda who made that determination. She referred the matter to the pretrial chamber, the panel of judges, asking them to make this determination. And the three judges of that chamber responded to her that given that Palestine has been accepted as a state party to the Rome Statutes and to the ICC, that the court and the prosecutor does have that jurisdiction. Now, since Palestine is a member of the ICC, that means two things. First of all, that the ICC has jurisdiction over any Palestinian who carries identification papers from the Palestinian Authority, irrespective of where they commit their crimes. So any crimes they may have committed within Israeli territory are also subject to ICC jurisdiction. But it also means that any foreign national who commits crimes within the territory of the state of Palestine as defined by the ICC, namely the territories occupied by Israel in 1967, is also subject to ICC jurisdiction. So the idea that Israel is somehow immune to the ICC because Israel itself rejects the court and the Rome Statute is absolutely meaningless.
Yeah, and that was my point. I mean, the decision to claim that the ICC does not have jurisdiction, that's not really true. And the target of attack seems to be completely erroneous. It's a foregone conclusion that they have jurisdiction over the territory. But it just goes to show the hubris and the arrogance that the Americans want to decide the interpretation of the law and the institution to which they are not a signatory to. And this is an enormous amount of hubris to want to do that, not allow the court themselves or members of the court to decide what they have jurisdiction over and which areas they don't. That was the point I was trying to make.
Yes, not only do Israel and the US reject the court's very existence, and most emphatically reject the court's right to implement its own agreed principles and procedures, but yes, they arrogate to themselves the right to inform the court which they reject how it should go about its own business.
Yeah. And let's see how Biden in particular responds, because these are, as we mentioned, 12 really hawkish pro-Israeli candidates, all backed by AIPAC. And the language they use, as I said, as you mentioned, is something that is out of The Godfather or any mafia movie. To threaten the family over such a situation is incredible. But in any case, I'm sure we'll come back to this. Let's move on to another story from last week. I thought was quite important, which is Saudi Arabia offering to the Americans about regarding the Abraham Accord, or negotiate a peace deal between the two, not peace deal, a negotiation between the two countries. There's an ongoing efforts to have Saudi backed, given US security guarantees and nuclear technology. And the discussion thus far has been that this will only be done in conjunction of a broader negotiation within the Abraham Accords and normalization with the Israelis. But that seems to be off the card at the moment as far as the Saudis are concerned. They seem impatient with the fact that Israel is embarked on a genocidal war. Who knows how long that will take? And the Saudis want this deal with the Americans done. But to most people, that would seem not unreasonable, unlikely, given that America will only agree to issuing any kind of security guarantee if Saudi Arabia normalizes relationship with Israel. So what is his plan B, and can it succeed?
Well, what's happened is that, as you mentioned, the Americans have been seeking to promote Saudi-Israeli normalization. As far as the Saudis were concerned, this was always about getting significant American commitments to Saudi Arabia in the form of a formal security guarantee American security guarantee to Saudi Arabia to defend the regime from any potential threats, foreign or domestic, and the US delivery of nuclear technology, and also in the form of a nuclear reactor to Saudi Arabia. And if the price that Saudi Arabia needed to pay for obtaining these American commitments was a normalization agreement with Israel, then so be it. And it was something that the Saudis were in principle prepared to do, provided there were at least cosmetic Israeli gestures towards the Palestinians so that the Saudis could present this as an achievement to their own public opinion, which is deeply, deeply engaged with the Palestine question, and always has been. And that began to change in recent months. Israeli conduct in the Gaza Strip has made it impossible, at least for the time being, for the Saudis to normalize relations with Israel. I mean, you know, even autocratic states have to take public opinion into account and can't simply do as they please on issues of such importance. So during a recent visit by a senior US official to Riyadh, I believe it was either Blinken or National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, the Saudis proposed, well, let's put the Israeli component of this deal to the side for the moment and conclude the bilateral US-Saudi aspects. The US would guarantee, would offer the formal security guarantees to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia would receive its nuclear reactor and nuclear technology. And in exchange, Riyadh would make a number of commitments to the United States about, for example, ensuring that oil would continue to be priced in dollars, that there would be limits on the Saudi relationship with China, and so on. And from the Saudi perspective, this was giving the Americans what they wanted in exchange for Saudi Arabia getting what it wanted. Well, that turned out to be wrong because, as so often in the Middle East, the Americans were placing Israel's interests ahead of American interests. In other words, the Americans said no deal unless Saudi-Israeli normalization is at the core of it. So regardless of what Saudi Arabia might do in its relations with China and in relation to its oil production and export policy to meet US interests, that would be meaningless as far as Washington was concerned, unless Riyadh first met Israel's requirements under this deal, namely in the form of normalization. And therefore, I think it's fair to assume that such an agreement, assuming it was ever realistic, is not going to happen anytime soon.
I think Saudis will also discover that their value to the US is only to the degree that they provide security and safety to the Israelis. If they cannot offer that, I don't know how much value Saudis offer the Americans. That seems to be the case with every Arab state. And I mentioned something a few weeks ago that, I mean, you push back against the idea that, you know, making the Middle East safe for Israel is always a #1 priority, and the value of each and every state and actor within that region is only to the degree they allow Israel safety and security in that region, and that's the #1 goal of the Americans. And here again, I would say in this negotiation with the Americans will never accept a Saudi deal unless the key criterion or the priority of securing Israel's safety is guaranteed. So that seems to be a no-brainer.
Well, there's also another element of this, which is we shouldn't forget we're in the midst of a US election cycle. This whole idea of Arab-Israeli normalization, not as part of a comprehensive Middle East peace, but in order to marginalize the Palestinians and leave them at Israel's mercy, was the key policy initiative of the Trump administration. And it is also the key policy initiative of the Biden administration. And therefore, rather than talking about the distinctions and differences between Trump and Biden on this region, given also that Biden refused to rejoin the Iranian nuclear agreement and so on, I think it makes much more sense to talk about the Trump-Biden approach to the Middle East. Now, in terms of your statement, I think the other half of it is that Israel's value is also in relation to its ability to serve U.S. interests in the Middle East. And given its utter failure to comprehensively defeat what is at the end of the day a second-order, modestly armed militia in a minuscule territory over the course of the better part of a year, it will be particularly interesting to see how U.S. elites, those U.S. elites which do look at the Middle East through the vantage point of U.S. interests and which see a distinction between U.S. and Israeli interests rather than seeing them as one and the same, how they will begin to view Israel's value in the years to come.
Let's turn our attention to the US in our final two questions. First is a new bill that was passed, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. That's sparked a lot of controversy, not just from supporters of Palestine, but also from within the American establishment, from the right, from right-wing Christian nationalists, partly because the way they look at this is that America has basically trashed the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is the closest to a religious creed, if you like, in the US. And the Congress has overwhelmingly adopted a resolution of anti-Semitism, which will more or less make it a criminal offense to criticize, question Israel's existence, and a number of other things. Do you think it will pass, given pass as in the Senate? It's passed the Congress overwhelmingly, and I'm wondering if it would pass the Senate. And if it does, I think we will see a huge backlash in the US from, as I said, American first nationalists and also Christian nationalists, and see a divide within the groups which Israel has cultivated for many, many years and decades to bring to its side. If they see that the First Amendment is being trashed for the sake of Israel, I think you will see a split within what has been strong alliance between the right and Israel.
May well be the case. I mean, we've seen now not only the United States, but perhaps even more so in Europe, states prepared to sacrifice what they state are their own principles and their own values, and now even their own constitutions upon the sacred altar of Zionism. In other words, yes, we fervently believe in these principles, but if they in any way threaten Israel's sacred status, then we're perfectly happy to change them. And what is happening here is a redefinition of anti-Semitism from hatred of Jews because they are Jewish to opposition to Israel, even if you are Jewish. So you have the example, for example, of one congressman, Jerry Nadler, who is very pro-Israeli, has a straight down the line pro-Israeli voting record, but his constituency also includes a large ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. And now, contrary to what many people may assume, the ultra-Orthodox are actually latecomers to Zionism and have traditionally been either non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist. And what Nadler was saying is that if this law passes, my ultra-Orthodox Jewish constituents who believe that the state of Israel, having been created by human agency rather than divine will, is blasphemy, um, will be characterized as anti-Semites. And that can't possibly be right. I mean, if this law passes, it will be legitimate in the United States to call for the destruction of the United States, to call for dismantling the United States, to call the United States a racist state, to single out the United States for criticism and condemnation, but not Israel. So imagine that a government accepts its citizens condemning itself, but not a foreign state. It's too Kafkaesque for description.
Yeah. I like the definition or the weaponization of anti-Semitism and the manner in which it's done, described by, I can't remember his name, who said that an anti-Semite used to be someone who hated Jews, but in current period, an anti-Semite is someone who the Zionists hate. So they
Yes,
completely
very well
inverse,
put.
inverse the whole definition.
I mean, we will soon reach a phase where it will be literally impossible to find any living being or inanimate object that is not anti-Semitic.
Yeah. And of course, this has real life consequences. And one of that is the crackdown we've seen in the US, but also elsewhere. France last week, Hassan Abu Sitta, a British Palestinian plastic surgeon, he was prevented from addressing the French Senate. He was invited to address the Senate and he was stopped from speaking. And this is a British Palestinian. And in his tweet, he said, Fortress Europe silencing the witnesses to the genocide while Israel kills them in prison. And the ripple effect of the crackdown and the backlash, you see, for example, in the UK last week, Palestine was a key issue in the local election, mayoral election. A number of candidates won because of their opposition to Israel's actions in Gaza. So it's having a real life impact on the ground in elections. And of course, Biden's election is coming up in November. So that too will be shaped by the ongoing genocide and the response to that. So the global response seems to be going in one direction, but the establishment and the institutions still maintain the position of supporting Israel, and even worse, passing laws and bills to crack down on the very principles which they are supposed to be upholding. And we see that, as I said, in France, Germany, US, and the effect has been also seen in the UK.
Yes, I mean, when the only reason you have support is because of the force of law, it means you've lost the argument. It means you've lost the battle for public opinion, because you have to resort to courts and police and so on to, how should I put it, to ensure compliance with your narrative. Because if it's simply a matter of something being openly debated, you'll get wiped out. And you gave the case of Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta. What happened is that a few months ago, he was banned from entering Germany to address a conference where he was going to describe his experiences as doctor in the Gaza Strip. And Germany then put a Schengen-wide ban on him. Now, my understanding, I'm not a specialist in French immigration law, but my understanding is that France could have given him entry to France only. I believe that under the Schengen agreements, national governments retain the right to provide entry to individuals, provided it is only to their country and not to the Schengen area. But more importantly, his own government, the British government, which is usually up in arms on these cases, to the best of my understanding, we've heard nothing. Now, on the more general issue, I think what's important, and we've discussed this previously, is that Palestine has always been an electoral liability for those who take up its cause. And Israel has always been an electoral asset to those who pander to its interests. We're now beginning to see increasingly cases of the opposite, where Palestine is becoming an electoral asset to people seeking public office, and Israel is becoming a liability to those who seem determined to uphold its interests. So that will be very interesting to see with the growing number of elections that are expected in the coming year around the world.
Yeah, and on that positive note, let's end today's conversation, and that wraps up another conversation review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my guest, as usual, Mouin Rabbani. Thank you, Mouin.
Thank you very much, Nasim. Always a pleasure to be with you.
See you all next week. Bye-bye.